So we're going to move on to our first news story of the month, and this is actually uh, cheating a little bit. This just crept in. Actually, this is technically at the beginning of September, but this was absolutely at the front of our minds when we came to write this month's Watching Brief Agenda, and that is the tragedy of the fire at the Rio National Museum in Brazil.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, uh, this story broke late Sunday night here in the UK.
Mm.
I was sat watching television and doing as you do these days, scrolling through social media on your phone and thinking about, well, actually, I really ought to be going to bed because I've got to, tomorrow's Monday, it's a working day. And the story popped up on my Twitter feed, in fact, that not just the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro was on fire, but also in Liverpool, almost simultaneously. It's an incredible coincidence. A very significant listed building called the Littlewoods Building was also being severely damaged by a fire. Now, the Littlewoods Building was derelict. It's being repurposed. Hopefully, it's going to be saved. But it's one of a number of significant fires in major buildings we've had in the UK in the last few months. Perhaps the most damaging one being the MAC in Glasgow. Glasgow School of Art,
and also there's been a major fire in Berlin in Belfast as well. Yes, yeah.
Yes, the bank building, isn't it? Yeah. Again, an 18th century building, one of the oldest remaining buildings in Belfast, which again had just undergone a multi-million refurbishment and again has been very heavily damaged. Yeah. But I think the one that really hits home is the Brazilian National Museum, because that. It wasn't just a building, it was actually a collection. And the current estimate is 80 to 90% of the entire collection's been destroyed.
Yeah.
And we're talking about items from paintings to an Egyptology collection, because it was one of those museums that began it was an Enlightenment museum. It was a cabinet of curiosities that had been collected over 200 years of colonial Brazil and then independent Brazil. It had an absolutely unparalleled collection of indigenous artifacts from the indigenous peoples, most of which will be irreplaceable, because many of those peoples no longer exist, and certainly don't exist in the cultural form that they did when they were first encountered.
No.
And so that's heartbreaking enough. One piece of good news: it's possible that, for example, the skeleton of Lucia, which is the oldest human skeleton found in the Americas, parts of that may have survived.
Yeah.
But what makes this cultural tragedy even more heartbreaking is the fact that it appears to be emblematic of a problem within Brazil itself. People are making the connection that. For example, we found out today, report in the Guardian, that the building wasn't even insured, and it had been so neglected in terms of funding. It hadn't been visited by the president or any senior politicians for years. Brazil's been in recession. Funds have been diverted to things like the World Cup and the Olympics, arguably away from cultural efforts like this. And the real heartbreak is that apparently they just reached an agreement with a sponsor to put in a new fire prevention and safety system.
It is an astonishing loss. Murcio Gomez, an anthropologist and former president of Brazil's indigenous agency, the FUNAI, compared the loss to the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria in 48 BC. He's quoted as saying, "We Brazilians only have 500 years of national history." But clearly, as you were referring to, those remains are much older. Was it 10,000 years?
10,000 BC, yeah. I think roughly is the date.
12,000 years, yeah.
12, yeah.
But he goes on to say, our National Museum was 200 years old, but that's what we had, and it is lost forever. He wrote on Facebook, we have to reconstruct our National Museum. Other people have been criticising the government. I think, as you were hinting, in terms of redirecting funds to support things like Olympic bids. But also, tragically, this had just been the 200th birthday of the institution back in June. They literally were celebrating that, and no one from the government acknowledged this. One person said that for many years we fought with different governments to get adequate resources to preserve what is now completely destroyed. My feeling is of total dismay and immense anger. And I mean, well, in fact, actually, this morning, I don't know if you saw, but there was some footage from within the foyer area of the building that was put on Facebook. I shared it on the RK-Suit Facebook page. It is quite astonishing, and it's also interesting because some people are asking how is it that certain things survived. But the thing is, funnily enough, actually, just as we were just referring to in the case of Vindolanda, you do get odd survivals in fires. Yes. So in the case of Vindolanda, you had the Vindolanda letters surviving a bonfire that was set to destroy documents. Documents survived, and in this instance, in house fires, you get random survivals. So, that's one of the reasons why certain pieces of wood don't appear to be burned on that footage. But I suppose inevitably, I find myself wandering back to other museums. For example, the British Museum. Could this happen here?
I think the short answer is that we don't know. And the first thing that ran through my mind when the scale of this became apparent was how many museum curators are waking up this morning to this news and thinking, there, but for the grace of God, the gods, or whatever I don't believe in, that could have been us.
Yeah.
Because we know how underfunded many, particularly local authority museums are, and many of them have very significant collections, irreplaceable collections. And I know, for example, and I mentioned this on my Twitter feed, I know of at least one borough archive with a very significant collection of documents that is stored in a building which is below the high tide level of the local river.
Yeah.
So if the river walls ever breach, that archive is probably gone. It's within a couple of 100 meters of the river.
Yeah, or if for example, reaction to a breach isn't quick enough, or if funding is taken away from repairing river defences, this kind of thing.
Absolutely. So it's fire and water are the biggest enemies of archives and museums, really more than anything else. There's the famous case of the in Florence of the floods in the 1960s, which took decades to recover from, and a huge amount of effort and treasure.
Certainly on I suppose on local authority levels, there seems to be much more of a risk. I imagine internationally this is the case. In terms of there's a link between budgets and preparedness for this sort of disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think that the directors of the British Museum and the V&A and there was, have just said to reminded their heads of department curators, and their building managers, check the resilience scheme, check it's up to date, make sure, again, heartbreaking story to hear about the fact that it's reported certainly that the closest fire hydrants were dry. They weren't working.
No.
So the firefighters couldn't actually put water onto the fire for until they found a water supply.
No. But also in the case of in the sense of preparedness, I know that it's not a museum, but the Macintosh building burning in such twice actually in 2 years. It does actually mean that significant institutions do need to have this preparedness. I suppose just one additional thought then. Do you think then that a potential response could or should be possibly, obviously we can't influence policy, but I'm just wondering if it would be a good idea for museums across the world to consider returning elements of their South American collections to Brazil?
Well, I think certainly there is a sense that this is an international. This has been high up the news agenda even in Britain, it's not been treated as a local story in Brazil. It is an international story, and I'd like to think that the international museum community, which does communicate, it does share, it does put material out on loan, and the exhibitions tour the world nowadays. And I'd like to think that they would rally around in a case like this, simply because I think, as I said earlier, people will think that could have been us. And certainly the deputy director of the museum, Cristiana Cerejo, has said as much. She's basically saying the message is we're alive and well, and we'll keep research on its feet. But she's also invited people to return material that's out on collection, or maybe look to find material that can replace at least some of the material that's been lost.
Yeah. I can hear some voices in my ear, not literally, but metaphorically, suggesting that actually, conversely, this is one of the strengths of having different museums in different parts of the world who have an international collection. That actually, if everything was returned to one museum, of a particular national interest, then it's all vulnerable at the same time. Do you think that's true, or is it more a case of perhaps we should be thinking along the lines of material does belong to a certain nation, but also perhaps keep it moving around for the sake of safety as well? So as you say, on loan, for example.
Yeah. I'm torn by this. Now, we've discussed this before, in particular in relation to the Parthenon marbles, or the Elgin marbles, as they're also called. Yeah. I think that for museums to start to return large portions of their collections because of decisions that were made 50, 100, 200 years ago, I'm not sure where that gets us.
No.
Sometimes the countries that didn't even exist, museum services that certainly didn't exist at the time that material was brought to the Pergamon in Berlin, the British Museum in London, the Smithsonian, whatever,
Although, bearing in mind, I'm not talking about returning material necessarily. No. It's more about
one of the
survival tactic.
One of the arguments that's often put up is that material should be returned en bloc.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is a game changer in terms of that argument, because that argument will continue will continue to be had between archaeologists and anthropologists and museum professionals and politicians and public. And the public, absolutely. But I do think what has happened in Rio to that collection, and they were talking about 2 million items.
Yeah.
I think that should give us pause for thought about whether actually the idea of these of a big honeypot of material is a risk that has to be certainly properly assessed and properly supported.
Yeah. Well, and just for those people who would chime in at this point and say, well, that doesn't mean the British Museum can just keep everything. Of course not. I think to a certain extent there's an argument there to also assess the British Museum as one of these vulnerable honeypots of material. Maybe we should be considering everything in museums as a resource for humanity.
What, absolutely. One of the first things that struck me about when I saw the video of the fire in Rio, and it is absolutely shocking when you think if you look at the implications. Thankfully there were no human beings were killed or injured.
No.
But that building is a similar vintage to the British Museum and a lot of the great world museums like the Louvre and so on. Yeah. That collection, it's as I said right at the beginning of this this particular segment, it's an Enlightenment museum. It's the cabinet of curiosities that people in the 18th and early 19th century collected for the public good, to share, to show how wonderful the world was.
Well,
it could so easily have been one of those other major European museum.
Yeah, well, and I would argue actually it is not only similar, but almost exactly the same actually as some of the slightly smaller university museums that you get. Those sorts of buildings, dark wood cabinets, glass fronts, this kind of thing. So I suppose all in all, great tragedy. lessons should be learned from this, but also hopefully, a positive discussion will come out of this as well in terms of how we view material from around the world, not just in Brazil.
I will be, I'll be very interested, and I'd like to be optimistic about the way the museum community might try and deal with this.
Yeah, yeah.